Hi, I'm Lloyd. Today I'm going to be reading A Goose Named Gilligan by Jerry M. Hay. Jerry is a riverman who lives on the banks of the beautiful Wabash in Indiana. He loves the river and all of its creatures, and often you will find beavers, herons, groundhogs, and eagles stopping by to pay him a visit. They feel safe with Jerry because he respects their right to come and go as they wish. Sometimes the water in the Wabash drops so quickly that the mussels are left high and dry on the bank. When this happens, Jerry takes his canoe and goes to rescue them. He knows that mussels are good for the river because they help keep it clean. The riverman pitches them back one by one before the raccoons have a chance to enjoy them for breakfast. One spring morning, Jerry was returning from such a mission when he heard a terrible noise. Then he had noticed frantic splashing near the shore. He wondered, "What's going on?" he thought, as he pulled his boat closer. At first, he couldn't believe his eyes. A very large goose was in a lot of trouble. The goose was tangled in a trot line and could not get free. In case you're wondering, a trot line is a number of fishing lines and hooks tied to a main cord and float, then anchored. Fishermen use them to catch fish without using a pole. The goose was struggling to get away, but the more he fought, the worse it got. His feet and wings were wrapped tight in the lines, and the hooks were getting caught in his feathers. The float was hanging from his neck, and if it hadn't been so serious, Jerry would have laughed it out loud. Jerry quickly tied up his boat, jumped in the water, and swam to where the goose was struggling. This made the goose even more frantic. Jerry swam all the way around the goose, who was hissing, warning him to stay away. "I know you're really scared, Goose, but I can't leave you here like this. You'll surely die," coaxed Jerry. The goose was having none of it, and as the riverman cut the lines, he was pecked and slapped repeatedly for his efforts. Finally, all the lines attached to the anchor were cut, but there were still lines and hooks wrapped around the goose. Holding the goose tightly, Jerry explained, "There's only one way to get you free. You and I are going to have to go ashore." Jerry fought his way up the muddy bank, the goose pecking and slapping, Jerry talking to him calmly to calm him down. They wrestled in the deep mud and fell back into the river twice, but Jerry was determined to help this stubborn critter. Finally, the riverman reached a firm spot on the bank, and he hugged the goose in an effort to quiet him. "Things will go better if you just calm down," Jerry pleaded. "I'm trying to help you." After what seemed like forever, the big goose stopped struggling. He finally understood that this human was trying to help him. "Well, that's better," said Jerry, as he carefully removed the last line. Unexpectedly, the goose started talking back. "Honk, honk," he said, as if he understood that Jerry was his friend. Jerry thought the goose would fly off as soon as he was let loose. Instead, the goose stood in the mud, honking as though to thank the riverman. "You're free now," Jerry explained. The goose slowly slid in the water and began to thrash about, pecking at the globs of mud that covered him. "What a good idea," Jerry agreed, as he followed the goose into the water. The two of them bathed and chatted, but the predicament the goose had been in. When the goose still didn't leave, Jerry became concerned that he might be injured and couldn't fly. By now, it was getting late, so Jerry swam back to his boat. The goose followed him, swimming in circles and repeating to his friendly honk honk. "I won't leave till I see you fly, but I do have to get along home," explained the riverman. With that, the goose began to run along the water, flapping his huge wings. Then he lifted off. Jerry watched as the goose flew in a circle, honking his goodbyes. The riverman waved one last time and headed home. Neither the scratches and the welts on his head nor the mud and his torn clothes mattered. Jerry was grateful that he'd happened along at just the right time. Early the next day, Jerry was awakened by a now familiar sound. A loud and insistent honking was coming from the direction of his dock. He threw on some clothes and hurried down to the river, where he was greeted by a visitor. It was the beautiful goose he had saved the day before. Well, now, it really is nice to see you again. I was hoping that I might run across you again someday, greeted Jerry. Honk honk, answered the goose. They visited a while before the goose flew away. The next day, the goose came by for another visit and stayed a little longer. He stopped by every day after that, staying a little longer each time. Soon, the goose could be found at the dock almost any time of the day or night. The goose became quite an attraction, and neighbors up and down the river stopped to visit with him. Some folks were afraid of the goose, especially when he came hurrying to the house to greet them with an enthusiastic honk honk. Don't worry, he won't hurt you. He's just being friendly, Jerry would explain. One day, a visitor asked, "What do you call your goose?" Jerry was startled. The riverman never claimed ownership of the goose, since he believed that all wild animals should be free to come and go as they please. "I call him Goose, or the Goose," Jerry replied. "But he has to have a name," insisted his friend. Jerry thought about that for a minute. "Well, I guess it wouldn't hurt. Why don't you name him?" She was very pleased to be asked. "I think Gilligan would be a good name for him. And your dock can be Gilligan's Landing." From that day on, everyone on the river called the goose Gilligan. It didn't take long for the goose to recognize his name, and he would come when it was called. Some evenings, Gilligan would be up at his landing talking so loudly that everybody on the river could hear him. During that summer, Gilligan and the riverman spent a lot of time together. They could be seen walking from the landing along the road or watching the sunset from the landing, and even riding Jerry's boat. Gilligan would sit on the bow and open his big wings in the gentle breeze. As fall grew near, large flocks of geese began to fly south. Gilligan called out to them that his landing was a safe place to rest. Jerry watched while Gilligan seemed to be talking to the other geese. The riverman wondered whether Gilligan was looking for a flock to join so that he could, too, make the long journey. Many flocks came and went, and Jerry began to hope that Gilligan had decided to stay for the winter. But one day, a small flock stopped by. As they were getting ready to leave, Gilligan began calling to the cabin with a very insistent honk honk. When he reached the landing, Jerry knew what was happening. Gilligan was saying goodbye. "It's okay, Gilligan. It's always best to follow your nature, and flying south in the winter is what geese do." "Honk honk," Gilligan answered sadly. "I'll miss you too, Big Goose. Stay away from those trot lines and come back to visit any time," advised Jerry. As they talked, the flock circled overhead, patiently waiting for Gilligan. That winter was mild. Many flocks of geese had landed near the dock, and Jerry waited, hoping that Gilligan would return. Then, one spring morning, he heard the familiar honk honk. Gilligan was back. What a great reunion the riverman and the goose had. Jerry gave a party that included wheat bread for Gilligan. Friends came to welcome the goose. What no one knew for sure was whether Gilligan was just visiting or was planning to stay. Well, stay he did, not only for that summer, but for the seasons to come. Gilligan had found a new home.